Hey, I'm Tim from Circuitous Effects, and you're watching Defining Circuit. Defining Circuit is a periodic interview series where I chat with fellow creators in the music world about what inspired and defined their passion for building, the moments, ideas, experiences, and even the circuit that sparked their drive to create for musicians. I've got Jesse Honig from 29 Pedals and Believable Audio with me this time. Thanks for being here, Jesse.
Thanks for having me, Tim.
Tell us a little about yourself and how you began to work with audio technology and making pedals.
I'll try to give you the short version. Got my first job in the music business at 13 as a roadie for local rock bands, and I kind of just haven't stopped working in the business since. I've done most of the jobs you can imagine. For most of my career, I have called myself an audio engineer, and I engineer records and stuff like that and engineer live concerts. And in the past 10 years, I've migrated to being an equipment designer after spending a lot of time also as a repair tech. There's a really long version of it that's really interesting. But in the short version, yeah, it's basically just I started working in the music business at a very young age, and I never look back. And I think if you live long enough in this business, you want to make your own stuff. You want to design your own gear. And some of it also just came as a function of like I was fixing gear for other people that I couldn't afford to buy myself. I've restored several vintage Neves. I don't own any vintage Neves. And so you just kind of want to learn to build yourself the good stuff that you've been inside of.
Cool. So tell us a little about some of those jobs maybe that first pulled you into building or repairing, or was it during kind of the engineering process? Was it during the tech process?
Yeah, I mean, it was basically like I was sort of your typical kind of lost teenager. By 13, I was obsessed with music. I had a drum set and a 4-track and a guitar, and I just would make weird music on my own in my basement. And I didn't want to participate in school or social activities. The only thing I was interested in was music and getting involved in doing more music with people. And a friend of my father's had a child who had a friend whose guitar tech suddenly quit their job. She was like a gigging musician around Philadelphia. She had like a weekly residence and would do gigs up and down the Northeast for this band called June Rich, if anybody's from Philadelphia in the 90s. Okay. And Jackie's guitar tech quit. And they also were looking to get a tech for the other singer, Vanita Gale. Anyway, we happened to be having dinner at a restaurant where Jackie worked, me and my dad, because we used to go shoot pool on Wednesdays and then eat at this restaurant where Jackie worked. And Dad looks at Jackie and he says, Jesse knows everything about guitars. He could do this really easily. And which at the time was a complete lie because I was much more into drums and recording and stuff like that. But, a few days later, they handed me like a rack tuner and a paper list of all these guitar tunings they used because they were really into a lot of like Joni Mitchell tunings and open modal tunings and things like that. And that was really the jumping off point. And I often describe my sort of path in the music business as like a little bit circuitous, but very linear. Like I worked for them and then they had to go to the studio to record their record. And so they took me with them just to bring their guitars in. And then I made friends with the guy who owned the studio. And he introduced me to a guy who owned a different studio who gave me the classic job of like tape op coffee boy. Mm-hmm. So my first job in a studio was working for this amazing engineer in Philly called Andy Kravitz. And my job was literally going to 7-Eleven for him and running the tape machine. And then one day we had a big session coming in and Andy had an old Neve that he had gotten like, I think he found it in a dumpster because it was just really broken, but he had rebuilt a lot of it himself. And he was like, we got to get all these lamps working and we got to get all these channels working because we have a big session coming in and I want the place to be really nice. And so he just hands me a soldering iron and he says, can you recap this module? And I just kind of like stood there not knowing what to do for a few minutes. And then he was like, okay, here's what you do. And he just didn't even show me, just explained to me in like a 5-minute lecture how to recap a 1073 module. And then I was off and I probably fucked it up and he had to fix a few of them. But then, the next thing was I moved to a different studio where I was doing some engineering, still getting coffee. And then I was doing at a studio where I was just engineering. And then I had my own studio and I was doing my own gigs and playing around town. And throughout the whole time, there weren't a lot of techs in Philly at the time. There was one guy who was a great tech named Paul Hammond. He was the only guy any of us knew who could fix anything electronic, really. And he was in this Led Zeppelin cover band in the dawn of tribute bands. I
Uh-huh.
mean, you're about my age, right? So you remember
Yeah.
like there was a time in the 80s when like
Oh
cover
yeah.
bands and tribute bands weren't cool. And then there was this explosion in the mid 90s of like
Yep.
it suddenly became cool to do a full night of playing Led Zeppelin or whatever. So anyway,
Right.
Paul was in one of these bands. And his band blew up. And so then we had nobody to fix our gear. And so me and my friend Matt, who had this studio in Philadelphia together, we just kind of had to fix our own gear. Not that we were particularly good at it, but we just had to. Then when I moved to LA, there's like a bump you get when you move to a new city where everybody on the scene will hire you to do just about anything. So when I first moved to LA, I was getting gigs doing engineering, doing session work as a piano player, session work as a drummer, and a little tiny bit of tech work. And then over the years, I just kind of got tired of staring at Pro Tools. I wasn't moving up in the ranks in some of those gigs. Like it was nice that people hired me as a session drummer when I first got here. And I'm a pretty good drummer, right? But now we're in Los Angeles and people can just call Jim Keltner or,
Yeah.
any number of people who are way better than I am. And also at that point, I was like in my 30s and I had been working in recording studios for 20 some years. Right. And I just kind of wanted to have a quieter existence for a bit. So I just started taking on more tech work and teaching myself how to fix more things, read more complicated schematics. And I got a job at a studio in Santa Monica called The Village, where I was a bench tech there. And they had a room where they had just been collecting broken stuff that wasn't worth fixing for like 30 years. I mean, they fixed all the good shit and the techs there always kept all the good shit running. But like, the stuff nobody cared about, if it broke, they just put it in the back room and they're like, we'll get to it one day on a rainy day.
Mm-hmm.
In about a year that I worked there, I fixed everything in that room. And I started to develop more of a philosophical thing about fixing gear. So many of my friends have so much broken gear, or like if something breaks, they don't know what to do. And the current kind of paradigm of commerce is like, if your amp breaks, just buy a new amp or whatever. And I've always sort of been a very working class musician. I rarely have the money to buy anything new or expensive. And so I just really accelerated my love of fixing things. And then it just sort of dawned on me one day, like, I know how to design PCBs. I've had my hands in the guts of just about every piece of gear you can imagine. My personal choice was to make stuff here in America. So I knew contract manufacturers in Huntington Beach that could help me do all the PCB assembly. I knew the metal shop in Pasadena so that I could get my metal made in America. So it's very linear. It's like I just sort of do one thing and then the next thing and then the next thing. And now I finished the first 5 pedals that I had initially conceived of when I wanted to start 29 pedals. So now it's like I'm taking like another, couple of months to finish like the next round of designs. Like what's the next thing I want to learn how to design? And it takes a while because I'm learning about it as I'm doing it,
That was definitely a linear progression to where you are now. Back when you were putting it together, that you knew where the manufacturers were, you knew how to deal with PCBs and deal with the people who could assemble those, especially the SMT stuff. Was there a point between fixing things and being a tech and then trying to go through that phase of prototyping? What is it to make a pedal? What does it take to make a circuit and then take that to the PCB phase? What was that moment in your life?
That's the reason I wanted to talk about the Tillman boosts so much, because I knew what schematics looked like and I sort of knew how to copy a schematic and hand it to somebody that could make it. But I didn't learn electrical engineering in school or anything. So I didn't actually know what was doing what in any circuit or what changed what in any circuit. And so I wanted to sort of go down to like a very basic type of circuit and see if I could just figure out what it does. Like I built this, which was, I call it the RF boost. Ding. This is the first pedal I ever built. David Kalish, who owned this studio I worked at, 10 years prior when I first moved to LA, he had a pedal somebody had made for him that he was like, this is the greatest pedal ever made, but I can't find this guy anymore. I don't know what it is. Can you figure it out? So I open it up and this is me trying to figure it out. And it's a really simple circuit with a single JFET and like 5 other components. And it used a specific JFET from like television repair. It's called the RF boost because it was like a VHF amplifier transit. I don't even remember which one it was anymore.
In the schematic, it shows the J201, right?
Yeah. So, but this was before. So I was just looking at this guy's thing and trying to draw out this thing. And I was trying to research online to see like what is this circuit? And you arrive very quickly at the Tillman boost because because that's what it turned out that this circuit was. It was just a modified Tillman boost that made a lot more gain. But you realize the circuit is an example of a very common emitter amplifier, but this is just a great example of a person applying it to guitar stuff. Like if you get a data sheet for a 201, they'll say, try this circuit. Yeah. And it'll look almost exactly like the Tillman boost. But he applied it to guitar. It was in the early days of DIY. Like he designed it originally in the 90s. It echoes a lot of really interesting things. Like his original version doesn't have any adjustable gain. He designed it originally to be an onboard preamp, but then very quickly people started putting it in pedals. And then when you have looked at a lot of schematics, I think sometimes you can see through some of the hype. So when people say like, oh, I love the Echoplex preamp. Well, the Echoplex preamp, we have one made by Exotic, essentially is a Tillman boost in a box. Okay. When people say like, oh, the sound of a FET amplifier like is in an 1176, it's actually not that different from a Tillman boost. Yeah. You know, FETs were the first type of transistor ever designed, and they were designed to emulate tubes as closely as possible, which is why we end up loving them so much in guitar effects. And if you look at this circuit, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 components in the whole thing. If you breadboard this, and if you can understand what these are all doing, then you can design your own stuff immediately. If you look at it, it's like the signal goes into the JFET, right? There's a bias resistor, you know, there's a drain resistor, there's a cap to filter the power supply, and there's an output capacitor to remove DC from the AC output signal. Like this is how I did it, is like I knew what things looked like. I could look at a schematic for, you know, a distortion plus or whatever and be like, this is a distortion plus. But I didn't really know exactly what was happening. And my path to learning what was actually happening was through this circuit, because it's so simple. Right. And you can put it on a breadboard and you can just put different FETs in there or change this resistor. And if you cook it, everything in there probably costs 35 cents altogether. Yeah. So you can blow up 20 of these trying to figure out how you want to design things and like how you want to interpret the meaning of this stuff, you know. Like I'm famous for overrating coupling caps wherever I can, right? Like I'm always a 4.7 will do, and I put 100 in there, and maybe not 100, but you get my but I'm famous for overdoing stuff like that. And a lot of people will look at my designs and be like, this is stupid because you don't need it, because if you do the math, your amp goes down to 1 hertz or whatever, and that's stupid. Yeah. But I do a lot of listening and I do a lot of measuring, and I make the stuff do what I want it to do and do things that I think sound good. And if you start with a circuit like this, you can immediately see how all these components fit together and how they work. And then, God forbid, you stack 2 of them together, and now you have, you know, a 2-stage amplifier that looks a lot like a fuzz face.
So going from the Tillman boost then to maybe one of your first production pedals like the Una or something, what was the process of how you got to, I want to make this thing that does something completely unique?
Yeah. I mean, it started mainly with the result I wanted to achieve for the musician, because I had made a few more things that looked a lot like Tillman boost but didn't make any gain. And I called it the Unity input stage. And I was touring at that time doing front of house. And I made 5 or 6 of these things. And I tried to convince all the guitar players to use them in front of their pedal boards, because a lot of them had the kinds of problems I often describe when people ask me like why Una works. Weird loading problems, weird interconnect problems, dull tone or whatever. But you learn by researching. I just like to read books about stuff like that and search on the internet. So I knew I had to have bipolar rails. I knew I was trying to get the stiffest input impedance possible. I knew I wanted to try to avoid parasitic capacitance like on the input trail. So you just start putting all these things together and just doing it, if that makes sense. And I also had just seen anecdotally from being inside certain pieces of gear, like how much attention people like Rupert Neve paid to certain parts of the signal. You know, in some tube amps, you run a wire a different direction, it doesn't sound the same anymore. So you try to start to learn where the critical things are that are going to make differences that matter to you as a designer. And then you get to the end and you have something like Una, which is a 2-stage IC amplifier that doesn't make any gain, that has really stiff input impedance, including at high frequency where a lot of other pedals will start to roll off.
Well, hey, I want to ask you another question about design, but this time about how you landed on the design for the enclosures for your pedals. And I know that comes from your knowledge of where to go for manufacturing and things, but it also has a very distinct look.
Yeah. I mean, I just knew from the get-go. I had built a few things in sort of standard boxes, and I have a lot of fondness for a lot of things that come in those boxes, even new things that come in standard boxes. But just for my own work, I wanted to have a custom enclosure, and I had worked so much on pro audio gear that I think is a lot easier to service because the enclosure is designed a little different. The things you have to do to get a circuit in one of those boxes at production is, to me, untenable, because it means you have to offboard wire all the jacks. You might have to offboard wire the switch. And at least in the pro audio and audiophile community, like a single PCB construction is always going to be better than multiple PCBs and offboard wiring and stuff like that. If you can get it all on one PCB and get it sounding good, it's a lot more serviceable and repeatable. And I just don't believe the hype of like offboard wiring your foot switch to make it easy to replace, because all it really does is make your foot switch less reliable. But in thousands and thousands of pedals that I've sent out into the world, I think I've had 3 or 4 broken foot switches come back, and you just use a heat gun and the foot switch just drops off the board, and it's not actually that hard to replace. But to design the enclosure, I just started to look at things that were around and look at things that I thought were cool. There was a few clamshell kind of designs that I had seen. We did something similar kind of at Slade. And even Hammond makes like a kind of clamshell sort of thing you can get if you look deep enough onto the website. And then I just, I did a sketch, and then I kind of made myself a paper mock-up of it. And then from the paper mock-up, I went to Tinkercad and made like a 3D model and had it printed in 3D plastic. And then I went to the local metal shop where I know the guys there, and I asked Juan if he would make that out of metal for me. And he was like, "Oh yeah, this is cool. I can make this, I'm going to chamfer this edge here. I'm going to round this edge here." And so he helped with the design of it. But the way the cute little chamfers bend at the end and stuff like that, that's very indicative of the kind of work they do at that metal shop, which is called Hamilton Metalcraft, and they're wonderful people if you want to hire them to make your own custom enclosure.
Is that same aesthetic going to go forward with your new stuff as well? Or
for the time being, I think so. Like it might get burned out on it at some point, but it's become a calling card of the brand. And so it'll probably stay. Like you've seen the shorter ones that have the simpler pedals in there. So there may be some things that are coming out that are bigger, but sort of echo the same shape. I'm debating whether WAMP, I'm going to try to stuff it in a smaller box or not. So far, it hasn't really worked the same. But yeah, so far, it seems like everything's going to keep looking like that. I mean, some of the stuff I'm working on is like 500 series or rack mount gear. So we'll try to get it to look similar in some way, maybe like the control panel aesthetic or whatever. But, obviously you can't put that shape in a rack, Yeah, I like my little design language. I mean, like, minimalism is all I really know how to do and make look good. I'm very envious of my friends who can make more complicated designs look really nice. Like the new round of all the new old blood stuff. Yeah. It's really, really cool looking. And I love the way that their design works. I just don't know how to do it for myself. And so I don't.
Yeah, right. Well, hey, that wraps up this episode of Defining Circuit. I appreciate you taking the time out to chat with me, Jesse.
Thanks, Tim. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I hope we'll get to have lunch soon.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this conversation, stick around. More interviews are on the way, where I'll keep exploring all the things that define why we do what we do. Thanks again, Jesse. This has been awesome.
Thanks, Tim. Talk to you soon.